Welcome to the first of a series of webinars for Falls Awareness Month. Our guest today is Pam Dean. It's a pleasure to have you here, Pam. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Now, Pam, I know you've had an extensive career in falls prevention, both in the health sector and at the university sector. So you've worked overseas, you've worked in multicultural communities. Most recently, you've been focusing on falls in SA Health. Can you tell us about that role?
Yes, I was the master trainer for the Safety and Quality Unit of SA Health in falls prevention. So my role was to help the staff translate the evidence-based guidelines into practice. What did that mean that they did in their everyday work?
And falls prevention is a really important public health issue. Why is that?
Well, we all fall as part of life, it's a normal part of life, but there are periods in our lives when we tend to fall a little bit more. So as a child we do, but we don't tend to harm ourselves very much as children because it's a normal part of the learning to mobilise in the environment. And as we get older, we tend to fall over every now and then, but it's usually when there's something in the environment that it's actually challenging our abilities more than they're capable of. For example, we slip on a banana skin, the classic old one, and everybody would fall in that situation. There are some horrible industrial falls, of course, from ladders and high places, etc. But that's to do with the work that those people are doing. But as we tend to get older, we do tend to fall a bit more because our capacities change as we age. And as you know, we have an ageing population, and so this is becoming an increasing issue of concern. It has been for some time. And at the moment, the statistics are that about 1/3 of older people, that's people over the age of 65, 1/3 of those people will fall each year. That is a huge number of people.
That's alarming.
It is.
So with the number of people who are at risk of falling, is it inevitable that an older person will fall?
No, it's not inevitable at all. It's not a normal part of ageing. In fact, fall actually represents, it's like an alarm bell which says something needs some attention here. So it can be something as simple as, oh, I need to have my eyes checked. Oh, I need to wear glasses so I can actually see where I'm going. I can move around in the environment and actually see where I'm going. So it can just be a warning that, okay, you need to do something about how you are functioning at the moment.
And I heard you mention the environment. So there might be a perspective that having a fall or falling over when you're older is all related to your sense of balance, but it's actually more than that, isn't it? Tell us about that.
It is. There have been around 400 risk factors for falls identified. 400, yes. And most of those can be changed in some way. So some of those are to do with the person themselves, is to do with their eyesight deteriorating, their reflexes slowing, their joints stiffening, their balance deteriorating, those types of things. Or it can be to do with something that is actually physically wrong with the person, like they develop diabetes, which puts them at increased risk of falling because of, they might lose sensation in their feet, for example, so they're not sure where they're putting their feet. Or it can be to do with Parkinson's disease, or the person's had a stroke. So there are lots of health issues that actually can put people at risk of falling. But there's also the environment which doesn't necessarily suit that person's abilities anymore. So again, we wouldn't fall over if we weren't interacting with the environment. If we never moved and interacted with the environment, we'd never fall over. And it's because we move and interact with the environment that we tend to fall when there is a mismatch between your abilities and the environment. So an example would be that, do you know that by the time we reach the age of 65, we need 3 more times light to see the same thing that we do as when we're 20 years old.
Goodness.
So that means that we just need more light in our environment as we age so that we can do the same things. But a lot of people don't change the lighting in their homes and therefore put themselves at risk of falling because they can't see where they're going.
And I can imagine there'll be broader public health implications for lighting in buildings, lighting in the environment.
Yes.
So you may know, I'm sure you are aware of the statement, it was Professor Ilona Kickbush, that health is created where we live, work, play, and you could add travel, Google.
Yes.
So what are some of the important environmental changes that could be made to help prevent falls?
You can look at this across the spectrum, so you can look at the individual's environment, so we talk about the home environment. People can make changes, quite simple changes sometimes to their environment that will actually help them function more safely within that environment. Things like improving the lighting and using it.
Yes.
There's no point in having the light there if you don't switch it on when you're getting up to go to the toilet at night and you can't see where you're going and trip over the dog. So you can put in night lights, for example, for that sort of situation. And things like taking up loose curling rugs, for example, just making sure that wet areas are not slip, those types of things that you can do in the home. Then there's the institutional environment. The health environment is particularly an area where people tend to fall. So the aged care environment or acute hospitals, people do tend to fall because they're there for a reason. They're not functioning very well, they're ill.
Yeah. So they're already vulnerable.
They're already vulnerable, and so they need the environment that will help to keep them safe. And the environment doesn't mean just the built environment. It means the people in that environment as well. Nature, animals, everything is part of your environment. And so those environments, the people in the environments need to be aware of helping older people to function well.
So awareness is a critical factor for everyone's safety.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I know that part of the call to action for falls prevention is that falls prevention is everybody's business.
It is, yes.
In your experience, how do you make that happen? How do you raise awareness so it is indeed everybody's business and not ending up being nobody's business?
Very good point, Melanie. Unless somebody takes ownership of an issue, it tends to be passed off. Oh, that's not my responsibility. That's somebody else's responsibility. So it doesn't get dealt with. So that's a very good point. There are a number of aspects to that. There is the aspect for health professionals, for example, who all have a role to play in preventing falls. The GP, the practice nurse, the physio, the occupational therapist, the pharmacist, etc., 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 podiatrist, optometrist, all of them have really important roles to play in preventing falls. And everybody needs to take ownership of that so that all aspects of falls prevention, remembering those 400 falls risk factors, not one profession can address all those risk factors. It has to be a multidisciplinary approach, and this is supported by the evidence.
And a whole of society approach to
society.
So have you got some examples of really innovative whole of community initiatives that you have been aware of?
Yes, one of the projects I worked on was the Stay on Your Feet Adelaide West Falls Prevention Project, which was a 4-year project funded by the Australian Government Department of Health and Ageing in the western suburbs of Adelaide, metropolitan Adelaide. And in that we interacted with such a diverse number of people. It was wonderful. So yes, we educated the health professionals both in acute care, in metropolitan domiciliary care as it was called then. We interacted with the peak bodies for the migrants, so we worked with a whole range of, like the Greek community, the Italian community, Maltese, etc., etc., etc. We trained volunteers in community health centres. We actually interacted with the libraries, where we put displays in libraries and resources in the libraries. I personally worked with master builders. I worked with the Archie Centre in helping them to see their role in building environments that were promoting function and safety. And one of the most interesting things I did was I trained the worked for the Dole people who were actually involved in redoing people's gardens. And they were recreating these gardens so that they were low maintenance, so that old people didn't have to go out there and spend so much time looking after the garden. And that was interesting for them and for me to see what their role was in helping people to prevent falls.
So trip hazards, identification.
Trip hazards, yes, making it easy to negotiate the environment.
And still enjoy the benefit of gardening,
right,
the psychological and the physical benefits.
Yes.
So the messaging for community with 400 risk factors, we know we can't give necessarily 400 health promotion messages, and it's contextual. What are some of the key messages that you've seen in your career that work for the community?
Partly it's everybody taking responsibility and doing their bit, and it's where we started was that falls are not inevitable. Something can be done about most of those risk factors. So here we have the key to preventing falls is to firstly prevent the risk factor from developing in the first place, and that's really very much in line with healthy ageing messages, keeping active, keeping your muscles strong, making and challenging your balance so that you retain your balance, because balance does deteriorate if you don't use it. If you don't challenge it, you will lose your balance.
So at Active Ageing, we talk about the relationship between staying strong and staying independent.
Yes, that's right.
And staying at home or whatever you prefer to do, things you want to do for as long as possible.
That's right. It's all about optimising your function so that you remain healthy and independent for as long as possible.
And so societal attitudes to ageing, we may be wrong here, but there's almost an expectation that for some people that they will fall over at some point.
Yes.
And we've heard stories anecdotally of people perhaps talking to their health professional and expecting that it's a normal part of ageing, when in fact, as you said, it's not inevitable.
No, that's right.
It's being preventive and staying strong, staying aware. And April Falls, from your career, what's one thing that we could do to make the biggest difference at a policy level?
Oh my goodness, no, that's a challenging question. I think one of the problems that falls prevention has always suffered is that it is not a diagnosis. A fall is the functional outcome of a whole host of interacting factors. So it's the individual risk factors for the person, the things like the eyesight and the poor balance, the weak muscles. But those on their own are not a problem unless we are interacting with an environment where that doesn't suit that person and puts them there for it.
The World Health Organization talks about all age-friendly environments.
That's right.
So I imagine that would include looking at that from a risk of falling perspective.
Yes, absolutely, definitely.
What about the cost of falls on our system?
The cost. It's a huge cost. If you can imagine, 1/3 of our 65 plus age group falling each year, that represents a huge cost. Not all of those people end up in hospital, but a proportion do. In fact, it's an interesting fact that 10 times more people are admitted to hospital having had a fall than are admitted from road trauma.
10 times.
10 times more.
Given that, is the investment in falls prevention significant to the problem?
Absolutely not. You look at all the money that is thrown at preventing road trauma. We hear about it. You see it on television all the time. You hear about it on the radio all the time. Oh, so many deaths from road trauma this year, from accidents, etc., etc. When do you ever hear about falls and the cost to society of the falls? Not just monetary costs, but the loss of the value of the old person. Because old people contribute a lot to society. They are primary carers of young people. They also contribute lots of volunteer hours.
And to our economy. As more people
to our
work.
economy. They're keeping working,
Yeah.
and yes, there's so much value that older people contribute to society is not even considered in that. And if you think, well, 10 times more people are being admitted to hospital from falls as opposed to road trauma, it's obviously inequitable.
And the investment is not commensurate to the problem.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So more policy initiatives needed across different settings,
yes,
including the design of buildings, the design of services, environments.
Yes, services. Yep.
And what about raising awareness amongst the public to perhaps combat expectations of an unrealistic expectation of ageing or stereotypes,
Yes.
inevitabilities? What is best done to change the way people think?
I think a strange thing happens about the concept of falls as we pass through the life cycle. In children, we accept, they're going to fall. In younger people, we think, that's just an accident. It's nothing significant. In adults, we think, we all fall every now and then. But as we reach a certain age, it suddenly becomes something that is shameful. That means I'm getting old and decrepit, and they're going to stick me in a nursing home, and I don't want to go there, so I'm not going to tell anybody about the fact that I'm tripping or slipping or that I'm falling, and they try and hide it. And by doing that, firstly, they will likely increase the number of falls they have. The greatest risk factor for falls is having had a fall. So if you've had a fall, you're more likely to fall again. So hiding it is really the worst thing that people can do. They need to say, hey guys, I've had a fall. Why am I falling? Let's do something about it so that I will not fall in the future. And therefore I will retain my independence for as long as possible and my quality of life. Because falling is one of also the leading causes of people losing function, and their world slowly shrinks because they do less and less because they're afraid of falling, and they want to hide the fact that they're falling.
And lose their physical confidence.
Lose their confidence.
Social confidence.
That's something that's not talked about enough, is the psychological harm that's done by a fall.
And even the language, I know we've talked about this in the past, in society you fall over until a certain age and then you have a fall.
Yes.
So the language around that is interesting.
Changes, yes.
And perhaps reflective of some of our misunderstandings around the relationship.
Yes.
So if I had an older relative who may be vulnerable, what sort of things could I do with an auntie, an uncle?
Well, one of the keys that the researchers found around talking to older people about falls and their prevention is to not talk about falls, for a start. Is actually to approach it in a more positive way and say, talk about maintaining independence and function. Because we know the research shows that all older people are interested in retaining their quality of life and independence for as long as possible.
Yeah.
So if you approach the message from that aspect, they're far more likely to listen to you. Whereas falls is a very negative concept in terms of their self-image. And so they don't want to see that side of themselves. They don't want to acknowledge that. And so we'll switch off and say, it's those evil
someone else
pavers in the footpath. They keep tripping me up.
Or it happens to someone else.
That's right.
So I'm really interested in that notion that we've talked at Active Ageing Australia about the notion of staying independent and finding that reason for moving for life and keeping active.
That's right.
So we think that might be a really important message for individuals to understand.
I think it's an important message for all aspects of healthy ageing, and part of that is health prevention. Yes.
And that if you have greater capacity to engage with your community, to do the things you want to keep doing for as long as possible, then that will really help motivate people to be more aware. Pam, given that you've mentioned there are over 400 risk factors for falling, can those 400 risk factors be categorised in some way to make it easier to address?
Yes, fortunately they can. You can group them. So, and you can group the first one I'll talk about is the ability to move safely within your environment. So that's to do with your muscle function, your joint function and your balance mostly. If your joints are stiff, it's very hard to move easily, and if you do get a bit off balance, you can't put your leg out to save yourself because your joints just won't let you.
Also, leg strength, I imagine, would be critical.
Leg strength, your strength of your muscles
your core,
is particularly important, yes. So there is a way of checking somebody's muscle strength and their likelihood of falling. It's called the get up and go test. It's where you actually just watch the person get up out of the chair, walk about 6 metres I think it is, and then come back and sit down again. And that will tell you a whole heap of stuff about that person's likelihood of falling. It'll show you their balance, it'll show you their speed of movement, it will show you their muscle strength. If they're struggling to get out of the chair, it means their leg muscles are weak.
Is that something that a GP, for example, might look for?
They could easily do that.
In the screening?
As watching their person walking from the waiting room into their office will actually give them a whole heap of information. It won't be the official test, but it'll still give them a whole heap of information.
And I guess that family members could be on the lookout for.
Absolutely, yes.
Be a fall spotter.
Yes, a spotter is a really good function for people to think, that person is likely to fall over, I need to assist them in getting something seen to.
So strength, joint mobility, balance are all critical.
They are, yes.
What about changes to our cognitive function?
Yes, that's a big one. So it's your ability to think and interpret your environment. So if you can't work out, for somebody who has dementia and can't work out whether that dark patch is a chair or a break in or a space, then I've actually seen this happen with a row of chairs in a dementia unit, and the person thought the dark patch was the chair and sat down in the dark patch, which of course there was no chair in, and fell on the floor. And that's their ability to interpret the environment, which is compromised. And so this is where it's really important to create an environment that's easy for a person to interpret. It's obvious what things are.
And it'd be safer for everybody.
It would be, absolutely.
It'd be that universal good design. And I know that many older people, well, a lot of people now over the age of 45 would have multiple chronic conditions that they're managing, living with.
Yes.
And the more chronic conditions that you might have, the more complex your medication might be.
Yes.
What's the link between medication and the risk of falling?
There's a big link between medication and falling in two aspects. So the first is the number of medications. Many older people are taking multiple medications, and the evidence shows that if you're taking 4 or more medications, then you are at increased risk of falling. And it doesn't seem to matter what those medications are for some reason, which is interesting. But then there's a double whammy if you are also taking psychoactive medications. They have a very high correlation with falls. So things like sleeping tablets and antipsychotics, which are also very common amongst older people. So it's a really important prevention strategy to sort out the medication so that the people are on the minimum amount of medication that they absolutely have to be on, and that those medications are at the lowest dose possible.
So regular medical review or medicine reviews would be important?
Yes, they are. And it's really important to involve the pharmacist in this process as well, because they have such that's their profession. They have a superior knowledge of medication and its effects. Another aspect of that we can look at is communication and behaviour. So the commonest thing here that comes up is risk-taking behaviour. A lot of
what do you mean by risk-taking behaviour?
It's one of the sources of greatest frustration for health professionals. I see these naughty older people doing all these things they shouldn't be doing.
No longer be doing.
And they call that risk-taking behaviour. I personally don't like the term because it does have that implication of the old person's deliberately being naughty.
Is it simply living?
I think it is. And we don't necessarily know what our capacities are because as you get older you don't necessarily challenge your capacities all the time. And I'll give you a personal example. I was in the swimming pool, hadn't been swimming for a long time. In the pool I was going to do my freestyle and I went, oh, the shoulder won't move. And then I remembered, yes, you've had a frozen shoulder. But I hadn't swum since I had the frozen shoulder, so I hadn't known that I couldn't do that anymore. It was fine because I just changed my stroke. But if you're halfway up the ladder, or if you're coming down the ladder and suddenly you find your knee gives way, then you're likely to fall and do yourself some harm because it's at height. So you may not have known that until you actually put yourself in that situation. So that's one of the aspects that we can...
So how do you ask someone or encourage someone to reflect on changing capacity, changing capabilities?
I think that's where the occupational therapists and physios have a great advantage in that they can help people explore their capacities in safe environments so that they do learn what they can and can't do and translate that into their daily function.
And assuming that capabilities and capacities can
change. You can improve them.
Yes.
That's right. Absolutely. You can change your balance, you can improve your muscles, all those things can change. You can improve your flexibility, you can improve your reflexes. Even if you're 90, you can still do these things.
It's never too late.
It's never too late. No.
And you're never too old.
That's right.
But it's having the opportunity to do that in a structured and safe way.
That's right, yes. Particularly if somebody has some incapacities already. Yeah. But being a healthy, active person, if you engage in physical activities, then you're more likely to know what your capacities are.
So you reduce your risk.
You reduce your risk. Yep.
Tell us about that. You talked about communication.
Yes.
What do you mean by communication?
Well, also one of the other unfortunate things that happens as we age is our senses tend to deteriorate. So our vision, our hearing tends to deteriorate a bit, and that can affect our ability to communicate and be communicated with. Yes. Like example of, I remember this dear old lady I was trying to work with in hospital who didn't have her hearing aids with her, and she was deaf as a post and didn't have her glasses with her, so she couldn't see, and it was really, really hard to try and communicate with her in a way that was meaningful. So that ability to communicate with that person is compromised. Also, it's the way you communicate with somebody that's important as well. In a positive, empowering way is far more likely to be taken on board than don't you do that or you'll fall over, which is the scolding teacher type approach. It brings out the child in the older person, and so they become defiant. Don't treat me like that. Whereas if you approach it in a more positive, empowering way, then they're more likely to listen to you and actually do what you want.
That's a really important message, not only for anyone that's working with older people, but I think as a general communication message, intergenerationally.
Absolutely.
It's about focusing on capacity.
Yeah. And as I get older, I
see that?
I see that, and I really object to being talked to in that manner. How dare you talk to me like that? You're half my age, and I'm an intelligent, capable person.
Which is probably the subject for another discussion,
yes.
Which really looks at the ageism and the endemic damage that ageism has in our use of language, which is again a discussion for another day.
The final, another category, as we were talking about the categories that the risk factors can be grouped into, is the person-environment fit. Now, this is where you try and, yes, you can modify the person and their individual risk factors, but you can also modify the environment to be more enabling for that person to function safely within that environment, and also optimise their function. So that we've talked a little bit about that already. So we've talked about the personal environment. The occupational therapist has a huge role in actually helping in that area. But there's also the community environments. So local government has a big role to play in creating environments that are not just age-friendly but universally friendly to people of all capacities. So children, people with disabilities, aged people, the whole spectrum of humanity.
Inclusive environments.
Inclusive environments, that's right. And then there's also the environments like the institutional environments, and we mentioned that earlier. Then the final category that you can put risk factors in is risk factors for injury. Because falls wouldn't be a problem if we didn't do any harm as a result of them. It's the consequence of the falls that are the issue. So you can do things to minimise the harm done by falls, and again that looks at the individual risk factors like bone strength, like people with osteoporosis, for example, are far more likely to fracture if they fall. There's also things like blood thinners are increasingly being prescribed, and this again will, if somebody's on blood thinners, there'll be a lot more harm done in the event of a fall. The number of subdural hematomas is increased hugely from falls because of that. I mean, it's designed to help keep them safe and healthy because they have an illness that is causing them to require that, but it does increase the harm done by a fall.
So being really aware of the consequences on falls from a range of influences.
Yes. There's also the environment that can increase the harm done by a fall, for example, concrete floors.
Yes.
If you fall on a concrete floor, you're far more likely to...
bounce. So
yeah, that's right. You're far more likely to break yourself than if you fall on a carpeted, nice, soft floor.
So Pam, listening, and it's been a pleasure to have a chat to you. Thank you, Pam. It's been an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you and to hear about your amazing work over a number of years. I'm sure you've made an enormous difference, not only to many people's lives, but also to our policy and our quality standards, and to the way our institutions and our systems now look more specifically at falls and the consequences of falls. So I hope that your legacy continues, and if there's one more thing that you would like to say, what would it be that we could change moving forward?
I think we all need to take on board this message that we have something to contribute to preventing falls. And falls is literally everybody's business. It's the individual themselves, it's their carers, it's their family, it's their support systems, it's the community, it's the institutions, it's state government, federal government, it is everybody. And if we all were directed towards preventing falls, then it would make a huge difference.
And together, we can actually make a bigger difference.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you,
Pam
Melanie, for having
Dean,
me.
thank you very much.
My pleasure.